Why have rents gone down for 4 consecutive months? And I know they're still too high, but why have rents gone down for 4 consecutive months? Because we're starting to get those illegal aliens out of the United States of America. Those criminals, those gang members, those people who are taking homes that ought by right go to the people in this room and your children and your grandchildren. It's simple economics. If you have fewer people, fewer illegal aliens trying to buy homes, that means American citizens are going to finally be able to afford a home again. It's very, very simple economics. When you ask, why is it that we have trillions of dollars of new investment coming into the United States of America? Because we finally got a president who says, if you're going to build in America, if you're going to invest in America, we're going to make it easy for you. But if you're not going to build anything in America, if you're going to try to ship an American job overseas, then we are going to penalize you for doing something overseas that you ought to do in the United States of America. That's what.
When you witness something so intellectually dishonest that it makes your brain scream for mercy, something so willfully disconnected from reality that it borders on the pathological, you understand why this moment demands not just fact-checking, but a complete moral reckoning with the politics of xenophobic scapegoating that J.D. Vance and his authoritarian allies have weaponized to devastating effect. The national median rent fell in November, marking the 4th consecutive month-over-month decline. And before you even process that reality, you hear this smug charlatan standing in front of working people, declaring with the confidence of a snake oil salesman that rents are dropping because we're getting those illegal aliens out of the United States of America. And you realize this is not just dishonest but monstrously cruel in its deliberate exploitation of economic anxiety. The housing price slowdown started in March 2024, 10 months before the current administration took office. But facts don't matter when you're building a fascist mythology that requires an enemy population to blame for structural failures embedded in capitalism itself. The sheer audacity of Vance standing before Americans struggling with housing costs and feeding them this xenophobic fairy tale, while the actual data screams something entirely different, should make every person who cares about justice feel a volcanic rage building in their chest, because what we're witnessing here is the systematic construction of what scholars of authoritarianism recognize as eliminationist rhetoric, dressed up as economic policy. Housing expert Jacob Vigdor estimated immigration has less than 1% impact on the current median sales price, meaning the effect Vance is describing with such theatrical certainty is statistically negligible, a rounding error, yet he's building an entire deportation apparatus on this lie. Evidence doesn't support the idea that immigrants in the country illegally are a primary driver of high housing costs, and experts point to a shortage of millions of homes caused by years of underbuilding, which means the real culprits are decades of failed housing policy, restrictive zoning, underinvestment in affordable housing construction, and the financialization of housing that treats shelter as a commodity for speculative investment rather than a human right. But here comes the truly diabolical twist that reveals the pure cynicism of this xenophobic pantomime, the moment when the entire edifice of lies collapses under the weight of its own contradictions, and you understand that mass deportation would actually make housing more expensive and less available, not the opposite. Immigrants accounted for 34% of those who worked in construction trades in 2023, far higher than their 18% share of the overall workforce, meaning the very people Vance wants to deport are the ones building the houses that could alleviate the shortage. Immigrants made up more than 23% of the construction workforce in 2023, and it's estimated that about half of them are undocumented immigrants, meaning the Trump administration's proposed mass deportation would worsen the worker shortage and deepen the housing crisis. When you increase immigration enforcement, you generate a reduction in individuals supplying labor to the construction industry in a given county, and those reductions are associated with a large decline in home building, which means Vance is literally proposing to make housing more expensive while claiming he'll make it cheaper, an Orwellian inversion so brazen it would be laughable if it weren't laying the groundwork for human rights catastrophes. Listen to how he frames this betrayal of economic reality, with the language of racial entitlement that should make every alarm bell ring in the minds of anyone who has studied how fascism manufactures consent for atrocity, declaring that immigrants are taking homes that by right go to American citizens, as if citizenship confers some mystical property claim that supersedes the actual economic mechanisms determining housing prices. This is blood and soil nationalism wrapped in the deceptive packaging of kitchen table economics, the ancient logic of ethnic exclusion repackaged for a generation that grew up being told America was past such primitive tribalism. Housing experts say the simple truth is that we would have a severe housing shortage even if President Trump were to deport every undocumented immigrant tomorrow, and the longer we scapegoat immigrants for America's self-imposed housing shortage, the longer it will take us to solve it. The actual causes of the housing crisis are systemic, structural, and have everything to do with how capitalism treats housing as a vehicle for wealth accumulation, rather than as a fundamental human need. But confronting that reality would require challenging the economic arrangements that benefit Vance's donor class. Home prices and rents started to climb in 2020 and 2021 as the COVID-19 pandemic drove demand for more space, and this predated immigration increases in 2022 and 2023, while the construction slowdown resulted in a shortage of about 4.7 million homes, meaning the housing crisis was already in full swing before the immigration surge Vance blames, which demolishes his entire causal story. When rents and home prices spiked after the onset of the pandemic, immigrants were not driving household growth, as foreign-born householders accounted for 25% of household growth from 2019-2023, amid particularly strong native-born household growth. The actual driver of housing demand during the pandemic was native-born Americans forming households, working from home, seeking more space, taking advantage of historically low interest rates, but that truth doesn't serve the nationalist project of constructing immigrants as civilizational threats who must be expelled to restore some mythical golden age of affordable housing that never actually existed. And wait, because this gets even more revealing about the bad faith animating this entire performance, because Vance isn't even internally consistent about his own xenophobic narrative, oscillating between claiming immigrants are impoverished criminals, taking resources, and claiming they're buying up excessive amounts of real estate. The American public is apparently supposed to believe that millions of struggling low-income immigrants are entering the United States and becoming servants, while also somehow qualifying for mortgages and buying up excessive amounts of American real estate, driving up home prices, which is logically incoherent, unless you understand that the point isn't analytical consistency, but emotional manipulation, activating contradictory anxieties simultaneously to generate maximum xenophobic affect. The undocumented population has limited engagement with many segments of the housing market, as undocumented individuals are barred from subsidized or public housing programs and face legal restrictions in some cities, meaning they're more likely to live in overcrowded conditions or double up with family members rather than purchasing homes, which means the very population Vance is scapegoating has the least capacity to impact housing prices because they're systematically excluded from the mechanisms that would allow them to compete in the housing market. The rent decreases Vance is taking credit for have nothing to do with deportations and everything to do with a construction boom that started years ago, finally bringing units online, which any honest analysis of housing economics would acknowledge, but honesty is not the currency of this administration. Year-over-year rent growth has been slightly negative for over 2 full years, and the national median rent has fallen from its 2022 peak by a total of 5.2%, while the national multifamily vacancy rate remains at a record high as a healthy supply of new units are still hitting the market, meaning supply is finally catching up with demand in some markets due to the construction pipeline that began during the pandemic. Rental affordability is improving in part because of a construction boom of new apartment buildings during the pandemic, with units still coming online now from projects that were started back in 2021 and 2022, which means the actual cause of improved rental affordability is the exact opposite of what Vance claims. It's more construction, not deportation, and mass deportation would destroy the construction workforce that makes affordability improvements possible. The timing of these claims should outrage anyone paying attention because the Trump administration has been in office mere months and is already trying to claim credit for economic trends that began long before they took power, which is standard authoritarian playbook material, but no less infuriating for its predictability. Housing price growth slowdown is supported by the Case-Shiller Index, which has risen only 1.62% since Trump took office in January, but this slowdown started in March 2024, 10 months before the current administration took office, meaning they're literally taking credit for a trend that predates them and has nothing to do with their policies. This is the kind of shameless appropriation that characterizes fascist movements that require a narrative of immediate transformation to justify their authoritarian methods, claiming to have delivered miraculous results through strongman tactics when the actual causation runs in entirely different directions. In the first half of 2025, the U.S. immigrant population declined by 1 million people for the first time since the 1960s, and the impacts are starting to show up in Houston's housing market, especially in immigrant-rich pockets of the city. And what are those impacts? Not cheaper rents and more available housing, but apartment leasing offices confirming that immigration policies, including ICE raids, led to a decrease in occupancy, with CoStar real estate analysts hearing the same from low-end apartments in Houston. Apartments are sitting vacant, not because Americans are rushing to fill them, but because deportation terror has depopulated entire neighborhoods, and landlords are losing money, and communities are being hollowed out. But Vance would have you believe this is success, this is prosperity, this is what making America great looks like, when the reality is economic disruption and human suffering radiating out in waves from his cruel policies. The construction industry's reliance on immigrant labor is so extensive that mass deportation would be economically catastrophic, and yet Vance dismisses this concern as deranged thinking. Vice President-elect J.D. Vance described the idea that immigrants are needed for housing construction as deranged in an appearance on the Interview podcast with the New York Times, which tells you everything about how ideology trumps expertise in this administration, how contempt for immigrants supersedes any concern for actual policy outcomes, how the cruelty is the point and economic damage is acceptable collateral, as long as the white nationalist project advances. Immigrants make up roughly 30% of the construction labor force, so any restrictions that slow migration or deport immigrants would result in higher construction costs, which would further strain housing supply and push up prices. And this is not speculation but well-documented economic reality confirmed by industry groups and housing economists across the political spectrum. Research on what happens when immigration enforcement intensifies provides a devastating preview of what Vance's policies will produce, and it's the opposite of affordable housing. When immigration enforcement increased under the Secure Communities program, the average county missed out on about a year's worth of construction over the 4-year period after implementation, meaning construction slowed dramatically, housing supply decreased, and prices increased. During Trump's first term, the Secure Communities program led to lasting declines in construction labor and home building, and rising home prices, with researchers finding that undocumented workers complement rather than substitute for U.S.-born workers, so deportations led to net job losses for U.S.-born workers, which demolishes the entire "they're taking our jobs" mythology, because removing lower-skill immigrant workers actually reduces demand for higher-skill native-born workers, since construction projects need the entire labor spectrum to function. The Center for Migration Studies estimates that 54% of foreign-born construction workers are undocumented, meaning deportations could cause the U.S. to lose between 1.7 and 1.8 million undocumented construction workers, which would be an economic shock from which the housing market might not recover for years. The states that would be most devastated by construction labor shortages from mass deportation are precisely the states experiencing the worst housing shortages, revealing how Vance's policies would compound rather than solve the crisis. Arizona, Nevada, Maine, and Florida have fallen the furthest behind in housing construction and would face major challenges building enough housing if construction labor shortages intensify, with Florida and Nevada particularly vulnerable given their high shares of foreign-born construction workers. Texas and California account for more than 1.1 million foreign-born construction workers, representing 37% and 39% of their overall construction workforce, while in Florida, New York, and New Jersey, 1 in every 3 construction workers were born outside the U.S. Meaning the economic geography of American construction makes mass deportation a recipe for catastrophic housing shortages in the exact places already struggling with affordability. But here's what should make every progressive understand the stakes of this moment. The reason this isn't just another political disagreement to be resolved through compromise and dialogue. Because what Vance is doing transcends bad policy and enters the realm of deliberate social violence justified through lies. Vance brazenly blames a small group of individuals for a problem that exists because of a chronic housing shortage brought on by decades of bad policy. And blaming people for a systemic issue prevents us from getting to real solutions, as the housing shortage is caused by regressive zoning and Byzantine permitting processes. This is scapegoating as a governing philosophy, the systematic deflection of responsibility from the systems of capital accumulation and political corruption that actually determine housing affordability onto the most vulnerable population available, and it works because it offers simple answers to complex problems, because it activates tribal instincts, because it allows people to feel that their suffering has an identifiable cause that can be eliminated through state violence, rather than requiring the difficult work of challenging economic structures that benefit powerful interests. Building codes and other regulations are critical for health and safety, but restrictive zoning keeps down housing production and incentivizes sprawl by banning multifamily housing. And with these restrictions on 75% of America's residential land, we're now nearly 4 million homes short across the country, with some estimates putting the shortage as high as 20 million. The actual solutions to the housing crisis require confronting the legacy of exclusionary zoning that was designed to enforce racial segregation, challenging the commodification of housing by financial capital, massively increasing public investment in affordable housing construction, reforming land use regulations to allow density, and treating housing as a human right rather than an investment vehicle. None of this is complicated from a technical perspective. The obstacles are political, because these solutions would challenge the interests of landlords, real estate investors, and the wealthy homeowners who benefit from artificial scarcity driving up property values, and that coalition wields tremendous political power in both parties, which is why politicians like Vance find it so convenient to blame immigrants instead. The historical precedents for this kind of scapegoating should terrify anyone who has studied how genocidal movements justify themselves through economic arguments that attribute systemic failures to the presence of demonized populations. Many have repeatedly villainized immigrants both from other countries and even other parts of the United States, as the explicitly racist language has been removed from many zoning laws, but the housing shortage and racism persist. And at any community meeting where housing is being proposed, you can hear rhetoric similar to J.D. Vance's regardless of political affiliation. This is how ordinary people become complicit in atrocity, through the gradual normalization of elimination logic that begins with economic scapegoating and ends with camps and deportations and families torn apart, and human beings treated as contaminants to be removed from the body politic. And if you think I'm being hyperbolic, you're not paying attention to the scale of what this administration is planning. Some economists say that blaming immigration for the housing crisis can be a convenient excuse for governments to avoid investing in social housing and other measures to improve affordability, as the housing crisis is exacerbated by many factors, such as high interest rates increasing building costs, land speculation, and investor purchasing zoning decisions, and municipal land use planning decisions. Yet immigration is often the scapegoat for social and environmental problems, and this blame game derails us from having real conversations about necessary systemic change. This is the political economy of scapegoating laid bare. The way xenophobia functions to protect class power by directing popular anger away from capital and toward the most precarious workers. And every time a politician engages in this misdirection, they're doing the work of the ruling class, whether they understand it or not, whether they intend it or not, because the effect is to preserve the system that generates housing crises while creating permission structures for state violence against immigrants. The cruelty of standing before working people and lying to them about the causes of their economic insecurity, while planning policies that will make their lives worse, is the through line of contemporary right-wing politics, the connective tissue linking every Republican policy proposal, from tax cuts for the rich disguised as middle-class relief, to deregulation, that poisons communities sold as economic development, to deportation, presented as housing policy. We would have a severe housing shortage even if President Trump were to deport every undocumented immigrant tomorrow. But if cities and states deregulated their housing markets so developers could build more freely, housing would quickly become more abundant regardless of how many people cross the border. And the longer we scapegoat immigrants for America's self-imposed housing shortage, the longer it will take us to solve it. The path forward requires rejecting xenophobic myth-making and instead building mass movements that demand housing as a human right, that challenge the commodification of shelter, that organize tenants and construction workers and homeless people into a political force capable of overcoming the landlord-developer-investor coalition that profits from scarcity. Vance's rhetoric about homes that by right go to American citizens reveals the fascist kernel at the heart of this housing discourse, because rights derived from citizenship rather than humanity are always preludes to atrocity, always the first step toward constructing non-citizens as expendable, as obstacles to be removed, as threats to be neutralized rather than human beings deserving of dignity and shelter. When you hear a politician talk about what belongs by right to citizens, you should hear the unspoken corollary about what can be done to non-citizens, about the violence that becomes permissible once we accept the premise that some people deserve homes and some people don't, based on their immigration status rather than their humanity. This is how concentration camps get built, through the steady accretion of dehumanizing logic that begins with economic exclusion and ends with physical elimination. And we've seen this movie before and we know how it ends, and we have a moral obligation to name what we're witnessing before it's too late. The most enraging aspect of this entire performance is that Vance knows he's lying. He has access to the same data everyone else does. He's not stupid enough to believe his own propaganda, which means this is conscious manipulation, deliberate exploitation of economic anxiety, to advance a white nationalist agenda that has nothing to do with housing affordability, and everything to do with constructing America as a space that belongs exclusively to certain people, while others are marked for removal. Vance's 30 million illegal immigrants claim is demonstrably silly, as he really ought to know, and it's outrageous to see the Ohioan routinely try to blame every societal challenge on those born outside the United States, which tells you this is a pattern, a systematic approach to governance that begins with identifying a target population and then attributing every social ill to their presence regardless of factual basis. This is textbook fascist methodology, and we need to call it what it is without euphemism or qualification, because the stakes are too high for politeness, because people's lives hang in the balance, because the normalization of this rhetoric creates the conditions for mass atrocity. What should emerge from this analysis is a renewed commitment to building movements that center the actual victims of the housing crisis, which includes immigrants who face discrimination in housing markets, who live in overcrowded conditions, who work construction jobs building houses they can't afford to live in, who are now being blamed for a crisis they didn't create by politicians implementing policies that will make housing less affordable for everyone. The effect of immigration on housing prices in the U.S. is relatively modest, as while immigration does contribute to housing demand, it is not the primary factor behind the recent spike in home prices and rents, with pandemic-related supply chain disruptions, rising mortgage rates, zoning restrictions, and shifts in housing preferences having had a far greater impact. The movement for housing justice must be a movement for immigrant justice, must refuse the false choice between native-born workers and immigrants, must recognize that the landlord class and the developer class and the investor class are the enemies of affordable housing regardless of anyone's immigration status, and must organize accordingly to build power capable of transforming the housing system from a vehicle for capital accumulation into a mechanism for meeting human needs. This clip, this speech, this entire xenophobic performance is a test of whether we're capable of learning from history, of recognizing the warning signs of fascism before they metastasize into genocide, of organizing resistance before the window closes and the camps open and the deportations begin in earnest, and we're left asking ourselves how we let this happen when all the evidence was right in front of us. Vance is constructing a permission structure for atrocity through economic lies, and every day we fail to challenge these lies forcefully. Every day we treat this as normal political discourse rather than incipient fascism. Every day we allow the Overton window to shift further toward normalized xenophobia. We become complicit in what's coming. The housing crisis is real. The suffering is real. The anger is legitimate. But the target Vance offers is a lie designed to protect the systems generating the crisis, while unleashing state violence against the most vulnerable, and our job is to tell a different story, to organize a different politics, to build a movement powerful enough to defeat this authoritarian project before it's too late, because the alternative is unthinkable, and the warning signs are everywhere, and history will not forgive us if we fail to act while there's still time to prevent catastrophe.